guys, I'm Raquel. Welcome to my channel Out of the Past, where I talk about all things classic movies. And today I'm reviewing the Warner Archive Collection Blu-ray of Sergeant York from 1941. This was directed by Howard Hawks, stars Gary Cooper, Joan Leslie, Walter Brennan, and a bunch of other amazing actors of that era. And this Blu-ray is a recently restored edition of the film, remastered, and includes a bunch of extras which I'll talk about, and includes this Blu-ray inside, which looks kind of like the poster cover art there. So the film Sergeant York is about Alvin York, who was a corporal and a sergeant during World War I. He, at the time of the making of this movie in 1941, was one of the most decorated veterans of that era. In fact, Jesse Lasky, the producer, was trying to get the rights to Alvin York's story for years, but Alvin York just kept saying, no, I don't want this movie to be made. I don't believe in movies. And Jesse Lasky just wore him down. And eventually, as soon as World War II started in the late 1930s, even though the United States was not involved, Alvin York decided, well, maybe it's a good idea to tell my story to encourage others to participate in the war effort. Now, this is a very interesting movie because it's about World War I, but it was released during World War II, and that becomes very, very important because this was a time where the United States was not yet involved in the war. In fact, a lot of people in the United States were isolationists. They believed we should not get involved. That happens over there, has nothing to do with us. But eventually, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that suddenly stopped being the case, and it was like full on into the war. So this was a very precarious time. Movies were being made about World War II in the United States, specifically with Warner Brothers, who released this particular film. There was Confessions of a Nazi Spy. There was Foreign Correspondent, one of my personal favorites, Manhunt, directed by Fritz Lang. But, Hollywood was very careful to tread. And this story was unusual. Alvin York was a very religious man, and he did not believe in going to war. And he actually was a conscientious objector and wanted, when he was drafted, try to get out of being drafted, and was not successful. But eventually he was convinced that he could do something for the war effort, and he ended up becoming this amazing war hero by employing these very interesting tactics that helped capture a lot of German soldiers. And even though there were only like 7 soldiers, basically corralling this humongous group of German war prisoners. So that's what this story is about. And one thing very important to note is that Alvin York was very involved in the making of this movie. So this movie is based off of his memoir. As I said, Jesse Lasky worked for years on, wearing him down to make the movie, to get the rights to make the movie. And then when he finally did, there were some requirements. Like Alvin York was like, I want Gary Cooper to play me. He was very adamant about that. Gary Cooper was hesitant, though, because he was not an isolationist, and he actually didn't qualify to fight in the war at all because he was too old and he had some health problems. And he was actually too old to play the role of Alvin York. Sergeant York was much younger, and he's about like 20-something years too old to play him. But Gary Cooper totally makes it believable. So, so that was one criteria. Gary Cooper had to play him. And there was a moment where they almost lost Gary Cooper, and Ronald Reagan actually had to do a screen test just in case they had to swoop in and put somebody else in. And the other requirement was Alvin York decided that he wanted, say, in who played Gracie. Now, Gracie's the character that Joan Leslie plays. She's this young teenager who falls in love with Alvin York, and they eventually get married. But Alvin York said specifically, I don't want a glamour girl. I want somebody who doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, doesn't go out to party, is just a good girl. So they actually were going through some options. They did land on Joan Leslie, obviously, who was absolutely the perfect person for that role. They even considered Jane Russell. Now, if you remember Jane Russell in The Outlaw, you think, wow, that's not really a good fit. But Jane Russell was very religious, so that could have been why they considered her. And they also considered my girl Susan Peters, who's my favorite actress. She was up and coming at the time. She was a teetotaler. She was very much like prim and proper. So she would have also been really good in the role, but eventually they landed on Joan Leslie. So in order to understand this film, you have to understand it in two parts. So the first part takes place in Tennessee before Sergeant York goes to war. So you got young Alvin York. He is kind of a ne'er-do-well. He goes out with his drinking buddies, who are played by Ward Bond and Noah Beery Jr., which I love. I love those two actors. So they're out, shooting, carousing, kicking up a fuss. And his mom, played by Margaret Wycherley, she's like very somber, composed, very kind of dreary, but she has a lot of love for her son. So even though he's like out drinking and cavorting, she is still very proud of him because he's an absolute amazing marksman. That comes in, that becomes a really important point throughout the film. And so his siblings are Dickie Moore and a young June Lockhart in one of her very first roles, maybe her first role. So he's like kind of a ne'er-do-well, and his family just goes to church, and he wants to marry Gracie, played by Joan Leslie, who's this kind of local girl who's being wooed by another guy who has bottom land. Bottom land is just a very sought after and expensive form of farming land. So he works to get that, but he's still kind of, just carousing around until one day he almost gets struck by lightning, but it misses him, and he converts to religion. So he goes to the church run by the pastor, played by Walter Brennan, and he kind of finds God. And what's interesting about this is that the actual story of Sergeant York's real conversion over to religion did not happen that way with, lightning missing him, striking a tree instead of him. What happened was his girlfriend Gracie converted him over, but they didn't want to show him being kind of, converted by a woman. They wanted him to be a very masculine, kind of single-minded kind of guy. So they had this other story, and it made for more a dramatic element. So you have him converting to religion, and this is where it transitions into the second half of the movie, which is totally different. So as I said before, he got drafted, and he was a conscientious objector, and he tried to basically not fight in the war due to religious reasons, but that didn't cut it. So he basically is kind of an isolationist. At the beginning of the movie, you have this scene where a lot of the townsmen are at a general store, actually run by the pastor, played by Walter Brennan. And there's a newspaper announcing the war in Europe, World War I. And they're all basically trying to ignore it. So there's a lot of like basically keeping themselves in a bubble. That is them, that's not us. It's kind of an isolationist mindset. And because he's religious and a conscientious objector, there's also that isolationist mindset. So how does he get converted over? So this is super interesting. So in the middle, you have this dramatic scene where basically one of the commanders gives he has a book in his hand, and he tells Sergeant York, Alvin York, well, have you ever read this? And it's the history of the United States. He's like, no, I've never read it, but I'd like to read it. So he reads it, and it's like this very dramatic scene. And you have to understand, this is a war movie that came out during World War II. There's going to be some dramatic, kind of cheesy elements, and this is definitely cheesy, but totally works for the movie. He's on this mountainside with his dog, and he's reading the history of the United States, and he's also got his Bible. So basically, this is the point where he's having a change of faith in a way. He's kind of using the Bible as a way to convince himself that he's able to convert over to this other Bible, which is the history of the United States. So you see him struggling, and he basically has to transfer from one good book to another good book. And he reads this line about, God unto God and Caesar unto Caesar. And then he's like having this internal battle. And then he decides, yes, this is what I have to do. And that's when we get into the second half of the movie. Now, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but the second half of the movie is super interesting. He doesn't have his drinking buddies anymore. Instead, he has his war buddies, including George Tobias, who plays his kind of like war bestie. And this is where we kind of see him as a fish out of water. He basically is this kind of rural Tennessee guy who hasn't really seen the world. So they're kind of poking fun at him because he's never been on a subway before. This is like a whole new world for him. But he comes with all this knowledge of being this amazing shooter, this amazing marksman. In the first half of the movie, you have this scene where he beats pretty much all the local guys at shooting this turkey that pretty much no one can shoot at. And he tricks the turkey into being shot. He basically calls out to the turkey, and the turkey pops its head up, and the turkey is killed. And the turkey's kind of behind these sandbags, almost like he's in kind of like one of those like war trenches. And then you see Alvin York actually in the war trenches, and he has to devise a very clever way when him and his I don't even know what it's like, his group of soldiers. I'm not really good at military terms, but they're caught in a machine gun trap set by the German army. So he has to figure out a way to get all his men who are quickly dying out of there, and he does. So that is like the big thing of the movie. And this isn't really a spoiler because it did happen in real life, but there's a lot of more elements to that as well. So in the second half, it's basically him at war, and then him coming home from the war and being decorated, and how his family and his girlfriend receive him. And you gotta understand, this movie, it's emotional, it's quite powerful. It really amazingly kind of shows the transition that America was going through from being isolationist into being pro-war, because he basically is anti-war in the beginning of the movie. He has that whole conversion point in the middle, and then he is full-on war at the end. So in a way, this film, which is distinctly about World War I, is in a way converting a World War II American audience into being pro-war. So in a way, it's sort of propaganda. And it's very interesting how it did this. So this is a Warner Brothers movie. It was one of the highest, or maybe the highest grossing film of 1941. And adjusted for inflation, it's actually one of the most successful movies ever made. It was a huge box office hit. And what helped was the fact that the United States stopped being isolationist and was pro-war. So this was a really great kind of pro-war movie. Um, and it was nominated for 10 Oscars. Gary Cooper got one for Best Actor and also got an award for Best Editing. And it's a really just fun, I think, look into, well, maybe not fun, but like it's a really interesting look into a very transitional period in American history. Okay, so now let's talk about the Blu-ray. The Blu-ray is amazing condition. It's a black and white film, so I'm not really good at telling the difference between, when a film's been restored in black and white, but it is very clear, very sharp. It looks really great. This does come with extras. There is a commentary by film historian and professor Janine Basinger. If you love classic film books, I'm sure you've read one of hers. It also has this really great documentary from 2006 called Sergeant York of God and Country, and it's about 38 minutes long. It's narrated by Liam Neeson. June Lockhart, Joan Leslie are both interviewed in it. There's lots of film historians just kind of breaking down the importance and the history and how it came to be made. Robert Osborne's in this. That was really great. I wish he was in it a little more, but there's a few snippets of him. Gary Cooper's daughter's in it, so it's a pretty good documentary, and I prefer documentaries as extras versus commentary. I don't know, I just prefer that, but you can't always get that. Commentary is great too. It also has 2 short films and a restoration trailer. So that's Sergeant York from 1941. Have you seen this film? This is one of the great classics. A lot of people have seen it. This was actually my first time seeing it, and I was quite impressed with it. It runs about 2 hours and 14 minutes, but because it kind of moves in 2 parts, it almost feels episodic in a way. You have like the first part, then you have an interlude, and then the second part. It almost felt like watching 2 episodes of a TV show with like a commercial in the middle or something. So let me know, have you seen this movie? Do you own the Blu-ray? What do you think? Thank you for watching. I hope you like this, and make sure you hit that subscribe button. It's great seeing you. Talk to you later. Bye.